Thank you. Next week's Mother's Day, and we have nothing except mothers. So actually we have a lot. We have a lot of mothers. Most everyone here I think has one, right, or had one. Some of you I'm not so sure about, Shirley, but she sits down front so I can pick on her. And the following week we go on our summer break. So this is it until next December. If I don't see you before then, have a nice summer. Okay? All right. We're continuing our study of the books of history. The books of history cover 1,000 years in Israel's history, from the time of the conquest to the rebuilding of the wall around Jerusalem. There are 12 books. We're working our way through all of them eventually. The book of Joshua tells us about the conquest of Canaan. The book of Judges tells us about the 350 years the children of Israel ruled by judges. Tucked in that book of darkness, there's this wonderful book called Ruth, a love story, the story of a kinsman redeemer, beautiful picture of how Christ is our kinsman redeemer. The children of Israel then asked for a king. And God said, that's a mistake, but I'll give you one, and he gave them Saul. And we read about that in the book of 1 Samuel. The period of Judges ended with the anointing of Saul, king of Israel. We're working our way through 1 Samuel. And there are a number of subjects in 1 Samuel that are worthy of our attention. It begins with Hannah, this beautiful, beautiful woman crying out to God for a child and promising to give the child back if God gives her a child. God gave her the wonderful Samuel, and after he was weaned around age of 3, God brought him back. Hannah brought him back to the temple, gave him to Eli, and he grew up in the tabernacle in the presence of the Lord. The next subject was that of the Philistines capturing the Ark of the Covenant. They thought that they would have a good luck charm. It turned out to be a disaster for them. And all they got, rather than victory over their enemies with the religious icon, what they ended up with was tumors, rats, and their god Dagon crashing in front of the Ark of the Covenant. The children of Israel asked God for a king, as I pointed out a moment ago, and it was basically God said, you're rejecting me as your king. You want a king to be like the nations around you? I'll give a king after your own heart. God gave them Saul, who was a disaster. We then spent some time examining the reign of King Saul, who really didn't care about God, and that was his big problem. And we, last week, spent a little time evaluating his reign. And then after he had been disobedient to God, God told Samuel to go anoint another young man to be king of Israel, and Samuel anointed young David. Saul was a king after their hearts, a disaster, and David was a king after God's own heart. We ended there last week. What we're going to discuss this evening is David's relationship with King Saul. His relationship with King Saul began when, as we pointed out last week, David was anointed with the Holy Spirit, then came upon David, but left Saul. And God replaced the Holy Spirit in Saul's life with an evil spirit that tormented him. And Saul's associates, assistants, attendants suggested that he listen to harp music. So they searched for someone to play the harp. They found young David, who now is probably a teenager, 15, 16, 17. We don't know the exact dates. We know approximate dates. Some dates in the Bible we've locked in, they're very good. Others, not quite so good. So I'll be giving you some real dates that we're certain of and some approximate dates. So David was probably 15, 16, 17, and he came and played the harp for Saul, and Saul liked him very much. And apparently then he went back home after a short period of time. And the next thing we read about is David killing Goliath, the story most of you are familiar with. And after David killed Goliath, Saul was impressed with the young man, and David was only about 18 probably at that time. And Saul insisted that David come back with him to the royal court. And David then stayed at the royal court for probably 4 or 5 years. And during that period of time, things went well between David and Saul. and sometimes they didn't go so well. David was blessed there. He was just a young boy from an insignificant family. He was thrust into the center of Israel's social and political life. That was quite special for him. It's like suddenly the President of the United States say, come down, become part of my White House staff. That's an honor. And he appreciated it. And Saul also gave David his daughter Michal as a wife. And Saul also made David a high-ranking commander in Israel's army. He was given 1,000 men. And God made David's forays on the battlefield against the Philistines, who they were constantly fighting, very successful. So the army loved him, and the people loved him. And David also was blessed with a friend from the house of Saul, young Jonathan, one of the most remarkable men you'll ever read about in the Scripture. And the big message from Jonathan is he's acclaimed not for anything he did, but for who he was. And I want everybody to take, if you learn anything about this book, learn about character. Character reigns. We think it's achievement. Well, maybe you achieved something great, maybe you didn't, but character reigns. We don't know of anything special that Jonathan did, except this: he was just a remarkable man, and we're still talking about him 3,000 years later. He loved David. He was never jealous of David. He was never envious of David, even though David was the successful commander on the field. And he had every reason to be envious from a human point of view, because David was going to take the throne that, from a natural point of view, and should have gone to Jonathan. I can imagine most young men being very angry about that. Not Jonathan. He was head and shoulders above most people. So anyway, David was blessed with all of those things, but in time, he was tormented by the house of Saul, and he was tormented because the people like David and the women were out singing a song and dancing, saying, David killed his tens of thousands, Saul killed his thousands. Saul became riddled with jealousy and envy, and for 10 or 12 years, he was eaten alive by envy and jealousy and hatred of David, which in turn led to David running because he tried to kill David. I'm just running through the whole thing, and we'll come back and look at some of the details. This is just a brief outline. In fact, things got so bad after 4 or 5 years living in the palace, in the compound, Saul's compound, that David had to run because Saul was trying to kill him and trying to recruit others to kill him. And so David spent probably 6 or 8 years on the run. He asked for help from friends. Didn't work. They would have helped him, but they were powerless. He asked Ahimelech, the high priest, to help him, and actually got a little bread from Ahimelech. He got Goliath's sword, so he had a weapon to fight with, but in the end, it was a disaster for Ahimelech and his family. And then he couldn't get any help from his friends, not because his friends were unwilling, but they were just not capable. So he said, if I can't get any help from my friends, maybe I can get a little help from my enemies. He tried to hide out with the Philistines, and that turned out to be even a bigger disaster. So finally, he went and hid in a cave in Adullam and started to reassess things, and God started to reconstruct a life that was falling apart. And finally, we'll talk about how Saul had an army of 3,000 men he would use to go and pursue little David. Now that's a little frightening, isn't it? It's bad enough if 1 or 2 guys are after me, but to have 3,000? But this was Saul, and on 2 occasions, David could have killed Saul. Didn't. Saul would repent, but this repentance didn't last very long. And finally, the story of 1 Samuel ends with Saul committing suicide on Mount Gilboa. So this is just a brief outline of what we're going to be going through in the next few minutes. David's relationship with King Saul. As just pointed out, it was good and bad. The last half of 1 Samuel is devoted to David's relationship with Saul. This book is 31 chapters long. 16 of them deal with David and Saul. Now, I'm just trying to keep you straight on how these books are put together. If you want to learn about the reign of King Saul, you turn to the book of 1 Samuel. Because Saul's reign began and ended in 1 Samuel. If you want to know about David's reign, you turn to 2 Samuel. Having said that, David is still introduced to us in 1 Samuel. He wasn't king when he was introduced. introduced to us about halfway through, and actually the second half of 1 Samuel deals a lot with David and his relationship with Saul. Sometimes it was very good. I mean, Saul was a little schizoid. I mean, he'd try to kill David, then he'd feel guilty about it and apologize, and particularly on those a couple of occasions when David had an opportunity to kill Saul and didn't, pointed it out to Saul and said, oh, you're a better and more righteous man than me. We agree with that. And I'm so sorry I did it. I shouldn't be hurting you. You're a good man. And then a few days later, he'd be trying to kill David again. So he had some real problems. But jealousy and hatred will do that. Envy and jealousy are just wretched sins. They will eat you alive. It's like unforgiveness. It's a cliche, but I'm going to keep repeating it. People don't hold grudges. Grudges hold people. And you want to be unforgiving? You know, the person that ex-husband that mistreated you 20 years ago and you've been holding a grudge against him ever since, you're the only one suffering. He went out and he's having a good time. But he found somebody else, ladies. I'm sorry. It isn't bothering him at all. And that's the problem with the unforgiveness. The people that we refuse to forgive aren't hurt by our unforgiveness, for the most part. They're just chugging through life, having a good time. We're the ones that are eaten alive by it, and you see that with Saul. He was full of jealousy, and I'm sure part of it was he was mad at God because God anointed this man and as his replacement rather than his own son. So he was eaten alive with jealousy and unforgiveness and hatred, and it destroyed him. So their relationship was good and bad. Sometimes Saul appreciated David. How could he not? And so he played the harp, made him feel better. Sometimes he hated David and wanted to kill him. Now, some of the dates, I'm just trying to give you a sense of some of the time elements in play here. Some of the dates that we're certain of. Saul, we know, ruled Israel for 32 years. We know that David ruled for 40 years, and his son Solomon ruled for 40 years, by the way. Some approximations. David was anointed king at probably about age 15. Not certain. He killed Goliath at about 18. He was in Saul's court with his on-again, off-again relationship with Saul from probably ages 18 to 22 or so. It may have been 24. It's hard to be sure. And then he ran from Saul from ages 22 to probably 30. That 22 could be 23, 24. But 30 is good. We know that David was 30 years old when Saul committed suicide, and that he became king and ruled until he was age 70. All right. David's relationship with King Saul, good and bad. He played the harp for Saul. Let's talk about that for just a moment. Saul was tormented by an evil spirit. We read about this in Samuel 16, 1 Samuel 16. So Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed David in the presence of his brothers, and we talked about this last week. And from that day on, the Spirit of the Lord came upon David in power. Samuel then went to Ramah. Now the Spirit of the Lord had departed from Saul, and an evil spirit from the Lord tormented him. Saul's torment was soothed by music. Saul's attendants suggested some harp music might soothe Saul. They searched for a harp player, and they found David. So now Saul lives up here in Gibeah. That's where the royal court is. Eventually, David will conquer the Jebusites in Jerusalem, and Jerusalem will become the capital of Israel and remain the capital of Israel for the next 1,000 years. And it's until just recently it became capital again. But at that time, the capital was in Gibeah, where Saul made his home. David lived in Bethlehem. Bethlehem is about 6 miles south of Jerusalem, and Gibeah is about 6 to 8, 10 miles north of Jerusalem. So they went down to Bethlehem. They found this young boy named David, who was probably 16 years old, maybe 17 years old. It's hard to be sure, but you get the sense. In today's age, he'd still be in high school. And so the relationship. David played the harp. That's his first encounter with Saul. And then we don't read about any encounter. It's just the scripture just sort of stops on the subject. We don't have any information that moves from David playing the harp into that of David killing Goliath. That was the next big event. And this is one of the great children's stories in the Bible. Everybody knows about David killing Goliath. It took place in a valley called the Elah Valley. This Elah Valley is about 15 miles south west of Bethlehem. And in this particular battle, the Israelites were encamped on the hills probably to the north. The Philistines were encamped on the hills to the south. And then there was this valley in between called the Ella Valley. It's about a mile wide. And I don't know who arranged these battles, but you get a sense that the word came out, it's time to go battle. And so the armies would get together. I don't know who arranged it all, but they would. They all knew when to show up. And what they do. In fact, there's one passage about David when he should have been out. It was springtime, we read, remember? And he was supposed to be out fighting the Ammonites or the Edomites or one of them. And but he stayed home, and that's when he got into trouble. But it was sort of, it's springtime. It must be battle time. I'm being a little sarcastic, but you get the sense they recognized there were sometimes of the year we have our football season, and they had their battle season. And they just, but you read about it, it was staggering. They just, I want to say, did anyone just say call a halt to it? But no one ever did. So at any event, they were all lined up, and every morning and every evening, this Philistine named Goliath would come out and parade up and down the valley and mock Israel and the God of the Israelites every morning and evening. Now, David was too young to be in the army. So now, that's the reason we believe he was probably about 18 years old at this time. From what we can gather, that's pretty good approximations, but don't hold me to it. Some things I'm absolutely certain of. Deity, Christ, justification by faith, heaven and hell, bunch of stuff certain of. I'll die of. I won't die for these figures. But they're pretty decent. Scholars have studied it in detail, and a lot of very smart people have spent a lot of time. And so we figured David was probably around 18. The word is that you had to be 20 years of age before they would take you into the army. So he was still too young to go in the army, but he wasn't too young to take food from his father's house to his brothers who were in the army. Apparently, every family had to supply food and drink for the guys in the military. So David goes from Bethlehem down to the hill where the Israelites were encamped to give his brothers food. And it was there he saw this Goliath parading up and down the valley, and he was not happy with that. He said, "Who is this pagan Philistine anyway that he is allowed to defy the armies of the living God?" David saw something more than just a soldier. He saw the bigger picture. He saw the forces of God and the forces of the pagan Satan. And as one guy said, he probably thought of Goliath as Satan, but whatever, that may be stretching it a bit. But he saw the really big picture. Who is this pagan that would defy the armies of the living God? He's touching on the age-old armies between, the age-old struggle between the forces of God and the forces of Satan. Fact is, not only did he see the big struggle, he was appalled at Israel's cowardice. We read about it here in 1 Samuel 17. As David was talking with his brothers, Goliath, the Philistine champion from Gath, came out from the Philistine ranks. Then David heard him shout his usual taunt to the army of Israel. As soon as the Israelite army saw him, they began to run away in fright. "Have you seen the giant?" the men asked. "He comes out each day to defy Israel." David asked the soldier standing nearby, "Who is this pagan Philistine anyway, that he is allowed to defy the armies of the living God?" Now, these are seasoned soldiers he talked to, and he's how old? Maybe 18. This didn't fly well. Didn't fly well. In fact, his brother was furious with him. His brother Eliab, David's oldest brother, heard him speaking with the men. He burned in anger at him and asked, "Why have you come down here? And with whom did you leave those few sheep in the desert?" A little sarcasm here. "I know how conceited you are and how wicked your heart is." Actually, no, I'm sorry, Eliab. His heart ain't that wicked. Yours might be. "You came down only to watch the battle." David then killed Goliath. We know the story of David killing Goliath. Now, this is, most scholars listen to this situation, this situation right here, and say, this is fairly common attitude among the Israelites. The Israelites have a terrible history of rejecting their deliverers the first time they show up and then accepting them the second time. Now here's David about to deliver them from the giant they're all running from, right? And eventually, he's going to become king and be Israel's greatest king apart from Jesus Christ. He will deliver, during his years, his 40 years as king, the Israelites from all of the surrounding Gentile nations. He's not only going to conquer them all, he's going to make them vassal states, which means they pay taxes to Israel. That's a good deal. David is going to deliver them from the Philistines and all the other grief. But notice initially, when David's about ready for his first battle with the Philistines, they've rejected him. But that's sort of what the Israelites had a terrible habit of doing. Remember Joseph? Joseph was the deliverer of the family of Jacob, but his brothers wanted nothing to do with him. They rejected him. In fact, they wanted to kill him. And as a compromise, they sold him to slavery. They rejected him. In spite of the fact he had some dreams suggesting that one day he was going to deliver them, but they rejected him. But eventually, when he became the second most powerful man in the world, they decided to what? Accept him, right? So Joseph was rejected at first and then accepted Moses. When Moses was 40 years old, he went out, and Stephen tells us in the 7th chapter of Acts, he went out to walk among the Israelite slaves, and he was preparing to help deliver them from slavery in Egypt. And he assumed that they would recognize him as one who was there to deliver them from slavery. And guess what? They rejected him. So for 40 years, he spent the next 40 years out in the wilderness tending his father-in-law's cattle. But then when he came back the second time, they accepted him. See? Joseph, rejected, then accepted. Moses, rejected, then accepted. Now it's David. He's clearly being rejected, but in a moment, he's going to show he's going to be accepted. And then, of course, there's Jesus Christ. The first time he came to earth, he was what? By the Jews. The second time, he will be accepted. In fact, Zechariah says they will look upon him whom they pierced and mourn as one mourns for an only son. Nasty habit they have there. So, speaking about David's relationship with King Saul, it began when he played the harp for him. It picked up steam when he killed Goliath. And when David killed Goliath, Saul was very impressed. At this moment, he says he's coming back and he's going to live with me. 1 Samuel 17:57. As soon as David returned from killing the Philistine, Abner took him and brought him before Saul, before Saul, with David still holding the Philistine's head. David slew him with a stone, then cut off his head and carried it around as a trophy. A little gory, but that probably scared the Philistines anyway. And from that day, Saul kept David with him and did not let him return to his father's house. So they're down here in the valley just southwest of Bethlehem. David kills Goliath. Saul takes him home to Gibeah with him, and David is thrust into the center of Israel's social and political life. These are the good years in his relationship with Saul. Not only did he make David a member of the royal court, he made him a commander in the army. Whatever Saul sent him to do, David did so successfully that Saul gave him a high rank in the army. This pleased all the people and Saul's officers. The army will always love David. They'll love him for a variety of reasons. One, he was a genuinely fine man. Commanders who mistreat the troops are not loved, I promise you. But beyond that, they want a smart guy. A guy that when he takes them into battle, they win. David was extremely successful. Everything he did, God blessed. Not only did God make David smart and gracious and good, God gave him victory. So the troops loved him. David was given Saul's daughter Michal as a wife. And David, as we pointed out a while ago, was blessed with Saul's son Jonathan. Jonathan was a remarkable man. As I pointed out a moment ago, one of the truly remarkable men in the Scripture. And it's not because he went out and slew a giant, not because he won a lot of battles. He probably did some of those things, don't misunderstand. He probably did accomplish some things in his life like that. But his great achievement was character. And you know what? What's wonderful about that is that's open to all of us. You may not be a soldier, a physician, a scientist, an inventor, or a businessman. Most of the things in this world we can't do. But there's something all of us can do. And that is to develop a godly character. See, This is the great egalitarianism of Christianity. True character is what wins. In the end, it's not, did you build a church of 1,000 or you build a church at all? Did you teach a Sunday school class or not? Those aren't the big issues. The big issue is character. And that reigns in the scriptures from Genesis to Revelation. And we look at Jonathan, a truly remarkable man. He had no envy of David. David's tremendously successful. Let's say Saul kills his thousands, David kills his 10,000s. No jealousy from Jonathan. The throne that should have been his from a natural point of view is going to David. What can I do to help you, Jonathan says. And actually pleaded with his father to back off of David and stop giving David grief. So David was blessed in the house of Saul because he was made a member of his royal court, a commander in the army, given Saul's daughter Michal as a wife, and Saul blessed him with his son. After David had finished talking with Saul, Jonathan became one in spirit with David, and he loved him as himself. And Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as himself. Jonathan took off the robe he was wearing and gave it to David along with his tunic and even his sword, his bow, and his belt. A truly amazing man. And David was blessed with him and always knew it. And when Jonathan was killed, he wrote a beautiful eulogy praising him. So, David's relationship with Saul. It began when he played the harp for Saul. It picked up steam when he killed Goliath initially. After he killed Goliath, Saul took him back home to the royal court, and he was blessed. But in time, David became tormented by the house of Saul. The blessings turned to torment because Saul was insanely jealous and on 2 occasions tried to kill David. That insane jealousy of Saul's was unrelenting. It went on for 10 or 12 years. And part of it, of course, was because the people praised him. Whatever Saul sent him to do, David did it so successfully that Saul gave him a high rank in the army. This pleased all the people and Saul's officers as well. The women danced and sang. Saul has slain his thousands and David his tens of thousands. Saul was very angry. This refrain galled him. They have credited David with tens of thousands, he thought, but me with only thousands. What more can they get but the kingdom? Yes, and they will. And from that time on, Saul kept a jealous eye on David. Saul became insanely jealous of David and wanted to kill him. Saul tried to kill David even while David was a member of his royal court. Now, David's going to spend another 6 or 8 years running from Saul and Saul's army down the Judean wilderness. But even while David was playing a harp in the royal court, Saul tried to kill him. We read about one of these events in 1 Samuel 18. The next day, an evil spirit from God came forcefully upon Saul. He was prophesying in his house while David was playing the harp, as he usually did. Saul had a spear in his hand, and he hurled it, saying to himself, I'll pin David to the wall. But David eluded him twice. Saul's attitude toward David was up and down. As we pointed out at the introduction, Saul would try to kill David and fail. Saul would then be smitten with guilt and apologize. Saul would then try again. And he was unrelenting. He was going to do away with David no matter what. Now, things got really bad. And so we're going to find that the last portion of the book of 1 Samuel describes David's years on the run. Our best guess is he spent about 6 to 8 years on the run, from ages 22 to 24, somewhere in there to age 30. Let's talk about those years. David was living in Gibeah with his wife, Michal, and he was part of the royal court. After, I guess, the second, maybe more attempts on Saul's part to kill him, and Saul was also recruiting people to try to kill David. David realized that staying in Saul's court was too dangerous, so he left Gibeah and went to Nob. Well, before doing that, let me point out that he sought help from friends. He actually wanted to stay in court, I think. He seems to have had a genuine affection for Saul. Even though Saul was trying to kill him constantly, apparently they had moments when they were friends. But before leaving court, he sought help from his wife Michal, from his dear friend and Saul's son Jonathan, and even from the prophet Samuel. But they were powerless to help David. So David sought help from Elimelech. He left Gibeah and fled to Nob. Nob was about 2 or 3 miles southeast of Gibeah, where the royal court was located. Nob is where the tabernacle was located. Now, at this point, you're saying, wait a minute, what happened to Shiloh and all those other places? During the era of Judges and 1 Samuel, and to a certain extent 2 Samuel, the tabernacle moves around. And it wasn't always hooked up with the Ark of the Covenant. Sometimes the Ark of the Covenant was one place where the tabernacle was another. It wasn't really until the time of David that the Ark of the Covenant was brought into Jerusalem. And then David made preparation for the temple to be built, and it was built under the reign of Solomon. At that point, they were hooked up together, the Ark of the Covenant and the temple, and that's where it all stayed. The temple is just a permanent form of the tabernacle, or if you want, you can call the tabernacle a portable temple. But once the temple was built, there was no more tabernacle because it replaced it as a permanent structure for God to dwell in. From that point on, religious headquarters was Jerusalem from that point on. But at this point, it's moving around a bit. So David went to Nob, where the tabernacle was located, and he needed bread. He needed bread. Apparently he was running for his life. He went to Nob, and he went to Elimelech, and this is not one of David's better moments. He's going to have some bad moments. He lied to Elimelech. He gave Elimelech the impression that he was on a mission for King Saul. So Elimelech better help him. So David said, I need bread. And Elimelech said, I don't have anything except the showbread. You remember the tabernacle on the right when you go in, there's a table of showbread, and each day the bread would be taken down and fresh bread put up. And then the bread that was taken down, the day-old bread, would be eaten by the priest. But it was sacred bread. It was consecrated bread. And nobody could eat it but the priests. Elimelech said, that's all I've got. David said, let me have that. And they also were keeping Goliath's sword there. So Elimelech, thinking that David was on a mission from King Saul, gave David the consecrated bread and Goliath's sword. Incidentally, Jesus mentioned this some years later. Did I put the passage here? When the religious leaders were giving his disciples a lot of grief. Remember that occasion when they were giving him a lot of grief? Let me find. What? 590. Let me read this passage. Because this incident that we just talked about David getting the consecrated bread from Elimelech at the tabernacle in Nob, here it is. Oh, I wrote it down up there, didn't I? That's God. Where are you people? Matthew 12. No wonder you had the page number. I thought, Rich has got all the page numbers memorized. I should just bring him up here. Okay, doing better than I am. What? So, Matthew 12. At that time, Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath. His disciples were hungry, and he began to pick some heads of grain and eat them. When the Pharisees saw this, they said to him, look, your disciples are doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath. That's not true. Now, if they'd gone out there with a bunch of harvesters, it's one thing. But to grab enough to eat was not breaking the law. They were just adding rules to the rules that have been established, sort of like Christians do. We add rules upon rules and rules and rules. He answered, haven't you read what David did when he and his companions were hungry? He entered the house of God, and he and his companions ate the consecrated bread, which was not lawful for them to do, but only for the priests. Jesus' point here is that there are times when there are extenuating circumstances. Now, actually, his disciples weren't breaking the law, but he didn't want to argue with them about that issue. He just said, let's go over to something else. There are extenuating circumstances. A man is hungry, you give him the bread. That's the point. And what Jesus was talking about was this event we just read about, where David left Gibeah, went to Nob, asked Elimelech, lied to Elimelech, saying he was on a mission from King Saul, and he needed food and a weapon. So Elimelech gave David the consecrated bread, and David's lie led to terrible consequences. Saul had Elimelech killed. He found out about it. Saul had Elimelech's whole family of priests killed. There were 85 priests. And then Saul went up and had everybody in Nob killed. Now, we can't lay that entirely on David. That was Saul's wretched, vile, disgusting deed. But it's an example of how one act of sinful behavior can often lead to others. David's lie to Elimelech ended up in the death of Elimelech and his family, his whole family of priests, and every person in Nob. So let's continue on. David didn't, actually things weren't going very well for David in Israel. His friends couldn't help him, so he decides he'll hide out with his enemies. This David is not doing real well right now. We always say he lied to Elimelech. He should have been counting on the Lord and telling the truth. But he lied instead with disastrous consequences to those around him. He recognized that later on and was grieved about it, of course. But if things aren't working out well in Israel, he says, I think I'm going to go over to Gath and try to hang out with the Philistines. He thought they wouldn't recognize him. Not a smart move. This is a picture of the ruins of Gath today. Gath was one of the 5 major Philistine cities. That day, David fled from Saul and went to Achish, king of Gath. But the servants of Achish said to him, isn't this David, the king of the land? Isn't he the one they sing about in their dances? Saul has slain his thousands, and David his tens of thousands. And let me tell you what was foolish about David going to Gath on the front end. Gath is where Goliath came from. So you can imagine that with Goliath there, the soldiers from Gath were there. And would you think they would remember the man who killed their giant? Sure they did. But David's not doing real well right now. And it's going to get worse. David took these words to heart and was very much afraid of Achish, king of Gath. Well, sure, he and his few guys are right there in Gath. So he pretended to be insane in their presence. And while he was in their hands, he acted like a madman, making marks on the doors of the gate and letting saliva run down his beard. And I love this comment by Achish. Achish said to his servants, look at this, look at the man. He is insane. Why bring him to me? Am I so short of madmen that you have to bring this fellow here to carry on like this in front of me? Must this man come into my house? In other words, don't I have enough whack jobs here in Gath already? I need another whack job? Our asylums are full. I can hardly pay the bills. They kicked him out. So David isn't doing well. David tried to cover his escape by lying, and hundreds of men, women, and children died in Nob. Now we find David slobbering at the mouth and acting like a madman. Things are not going well. From Gibeah to Nob to Gath, so David takes off for Adullam. Adullam is a place where there were some caves. And Dave went to this cave. This is one of the caves at Adullam. This is an actual picture. There are other caves, so we don't know if this is the one David went to. His friends couldn't protect him. His enemies would not protect him. Their asylums were full. So David takes off for the cave of Adullam, and it was at Adullam that he starts to get his life back together. David left Gath and escaped to the cave of Adullam. When his brothers and father's household heard about it, they went down to him there. All those who were in distress or in debt or discontented gathered around him, and he became their leader. All I can think of was, David, I think I'd go back to Gath and slobber. Now, what's interesting now, we're going to talk in a moment about it, we know from the Psalms that this was a turning point in his life. Now, he's had a number of turning points, don't misunderstand, but he'd gone to Saul's court. He was celebrated. Things were going well. His world fell apart. His wife couldn't help him, Saul's daughter. Saul's son Jonathan couldn't help him. Samuel couldn't help him. He goes to Nob. Elimelech, the high priest, can't help him. In fact, he and his family died trying to help David. His enemies won't help him. So David, who has always trusted God, is going to start getting his act together again. Keep in mind, When I say it's a turning point, it's just it's another course correction. When David faced Goliath, he was depending upon whom? God. But who's he been depending on during these problems with Saul? Well, he depended on his friends, Michael and Jonathan and Samuel, and then the high priest Elimelech, and now he's trying to depend on the Philistines. Things are not going well. So he goes to the cave of Adullam, and things are going to start turning around. But you wonder, God, why are you helping him out this way? He's sending him all these discontented, the malcontents. David reassessed his situation. He came to his senses. He cried out to God for help, and he wrote about this in the cave psalms. There are 4 cave psalms, 34, 56, 57, 142. I'm not quite sure which one he wrote at this particular cave, but we're reading just a little bit of it here. Psalm 142, a maskil of David when he was in the cave. And this is what David wrote. Now we know that he's making a course correction here. I cried out to the Lord. I plead for the Lord's mercy. I pour out my complaints before him and tell him all my troubles. When I'm overwhelmed, you alone know the way I should turn. Wherever I go, my enemies have set traps for me. I look for someone to come and help me, but no one gives me a passing thought. No one will help me. No one cares a bit what happens to me. That's not exactly true. His friends helped, wanted to help. They did care, but they were powerless. But at this point, David's just feeling a little bit sorry for himself. And that's fine. We do that. Well, maybe you don't, but most of us, normal people do. Then I pray to you, O Lord. I say, you are my place of refuge. You are all I really want in life. Hear my cry, for I am very low. Rescue me from my persecutors, for they are too strong for me. Set me free from my prison so I can thank you. The godly will crowd around me, for you are good to me. Now notice the change in attitude David has. His friends couldn't help, the high priest couldn't help, the prophet couldn't help, the enemies won't help. So guess he's turning to? Well, that had always worked for him before, hadn't it? I'm sure when he was out there tending his father's sheep and he was attacked by a lion, he didn't cry out for anyone other than God. And when he was attacked by the bear, he was calling out to God. When he stood up before Goliath, he wasn't looking at the Israeli army because they were all running. Who did he look to? God. So guess what he's doing at the cave of Adullam? God. This is lesson here. And God answers his prayer by sending him a bunch of discontents and malcontents. You're saying, God, what are you doing? You know what? If I was in that position, I'm in the cave, I've finally come to my senses. I'm not going to be asking my friends for help, priests for help, prophets for help, enemies for protection. I'm going to be crying out to God, and God, I hope, will send me a bunch of those sharp guys from West Point. Maybe Annapolis, but West Point. No, my Navy guy isn't here. It's a shame. Carmen should be here. That was designed for him. I hope you're watching Carmen on TV. That's what he wants, but that's not what God does. He sends people who are unhappy. He sends these malcontents, these misfits, the people who are in debt because they probably got themselves, they were foolish. And you say, God, what kind of help are you giving me? Actually, God was giving fabulous help. These 400 men are repeatedly called David's mighty men of valor. They became the core of the greatest army in Israel's history. These 400 are going to follow David now for the next 6 years or so. And David's going to train them and discipline them. And together they're going to learn to fight Philistines in a magnificent way, city-state Canaanites, Amalekites. This core 400, these 400 men, these malcontents and these misfits that come to David at the cave of Adullam are going to form the core of Israel's greatest army, an army that was so great that during David's reign, even when he became king, they went with him and became the core of Israel's great army, an army that was unmatched in Israel's history. They conquered all of the surrounding Gentile nations and made them vassal states. So God was answering his prayer. He was crying out to God for help. And we look at it and we say, this is sort of an example. Sometimes we cry out to God for help, And we see the help coming, say, that doesn't look much like help. This looks like more grief. This guy with the debts, he probably wants my credit card. I can't get him out of trouble. But see what God is doing. David cried out for help. God sent help. I think David was so low, he's willing to accept whatever he could get. And what he got was, and turns out, was wonderful. David left Gath and escaped to the cave of Adullam. When his brothers and father's household heard about it, they went down to him there. All those who were in distress and debt and discontented gathered around him. He became their leader. About 400 men were with him. David sought refuge in the cave of Adullam. He reassessed his situation. God began putting David's life back together. Those discontented, as pointed out, would become the core of David's great army. They repeatedly called David's mighty men of valor. Saul, however, he's still a problem. He's determined to kill David. During his 6 to 8 years in the Judean wilderness, this area right here, south of Jerusalem, between the Dead Sea and the Mediterranean Ocean, David will wander around there for 6 to 8 years, and he will have to fight Philistines, Amalekites, Canaanite city-states, and guess who? Saul. Twice David spared Saul's life. One time was at En-Gedi, and another time was in the desert of Ziz. At En-Gedi, David and his troops were hiding way in a cave. It was dark. Saul came in. He had his 3,000 men out there. He was looking for David at the time. Saul came in to relieve himself. Now, Saul couldn't see, coming in from the light, couldn't see these men back in the dark end of the cave. But they could see him because he's a profile against the light at the entrance of the cave. David slipped up and cut a little piece of his garment off. Now, David's men wanted him to kill Saul. And David said, I won't do it. He's God's anointed. And then after Saul left, David stood on the mountain and showed the piece of garment that he had snipped from Saul's robe, and showed him that he could have killed him but chose not to. And let me see if I can get this comment. Here we are. After Saul returned from pursuing the Philistines, he was told, David is in the desert of En-Gedi. So Saul took 3,000 chosen men from all Israel and set out to look for David and his men near the crags of the wild goats. And we read about all of that going back in the cave. And when David held up the piece of Saul's garment, Saul realized that David could have killed him. And this is what David saw, how Saul responded. When David finished saying to Saul that he could have killed him, Saul asked, is that your voice, David, my son? And he wept aloud. You're more righteous than I. He said, you have treated me well, but I've treated you badly. It should have been over then, right? It wasn't. A little later, Saul is after David again in the desert of Ziph. In the desert of Ziph, David saw Saul and his men encamped. God caused a deep sleep to come over the troops. And David and the buddies slipped into the camp. David took Saul's sword and his water jug. And then he crossed to the other side, just some distance away, and the following day held them up, and Saul recognized David again. I read it in 1 Samuel 26. Saul recognized David's voice and said, is that your voice? David, my son. Yes, it is, my lord the king. Then Saul said, I have sinned. Come back, David, my son, because you considered my life precious today. I will not try to harm you again. Surely I have acted like a fool and have erred greatly. This is a pattern, isn't it? David could kill Saul. He doesn't. He points it out to Saul. Saul becomes deeply remorseful. He probably was remorseful, but it only lasts for a moment. Then he was back trying to kill David. Finally, the book of 1 Samuel ends with Saul's suicide. It was the last major event in this book. Saul had mustered his troops on Mount Gilboa. If you remember from our study in geography, this is northern Israel. There's the Sea of Galilee, Mount Carmel, and then Mount Tabor, Moriah, and Gilboa, Mount Moreh. And this plain in here is called the plain of Esdraelon or Armageddon. This is where the staging area for the last great army. This is Armageddon. Anyway, Saul is here on Mount Gilboa. He's wounded in his battle with the Philistines. He asks his armor bearer to kill him. He wouldn't, so Saul kills himself. And in doing so, a foolish life ends. This then is 1 Samuel, and in particular the relationship David had during the second half of Samuel with King Saul. It began when David played the harp for Saul, and it picked up, then it sort of was a gap. Then we read about the relationship when David killed Goliath. Initially, when David was taken to Saul's court, things were good. But in time, David was tormented by the house of Saul, and he spent years on the run. He asked his friends for help. They would have helped, but they were powerless. David asked Abimelech for bread and Goliath's sword. He lied. It cost hundreds of people to die. He tried to find refuge in Gath. They didn't want him. Their sidearms were full. And David then and his men go to the cave of Adullam, where he writes that beautiful psalm in which he's turning again to God for help. And we read about David sparing Saul's life twice, and finally it ends with Saul committing suicide on Mount Gilboa. Saul is a story of a man who lived a foolish, foolish, foolish life. It could have been his. You realize that? He was the anointed one. It could have been the house of Saul on which Jesus was born. He could have been a son of Saul. When he returns to earth, he could have been sitting on Saul's throne. But Saul blew it. And that's sad. That's very sad. With that, we'll close. I'll see you next spring. Next fall. Well, next spring. Fall. Yes, fall. Fall. I can't see. I can't. Father, we love you. We worship you. We thank you for giving us these records of men who've preceded us. I pray, Father, that we learn to imitate the good ones. And there were a lot of them who were incredibly noble and glorious, and I pray we do. Give us a good summer, I pray, in Jesus' name. Amen.